The first time it happened, the hiring manager stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. His expression changed in a way I could not immediately understand. It was not anger. It was not confusion either. It looked more like caution. He said my qualifications were strong. He said the interview had gone well. Then he paused and asked a question that did not belong in the conversation. He asked if there was anything from my past I wanted to disclose. I did not understand what he meant. He slid a printed note across the desk. A short message. A phone call, he said. Someone had warned them about me. Someone had said I had a criminal record. And the strangest part was not the accusation. It was the voice they claimed had made the call. I used to believe that my life was moving forward in a simple and predictable way. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady. I finished my degree quietly. I was never the kind of person who drew attention to myself in classrooms or group discussions. I listened more than I spoke. I worked carefully. I submitted assignments early. When professors asked questions, I answered directly and then went back to being quiet. People often mistook silence for weakness. I learned that early. But silence also meant I noticed things other people ignored. When graduation arrived, my parents were proud. At least that is how it appeared on the surface. My mother told relatives that I had always been responsible. My father repeated the same story whenever neighbors asked about my plans. They spoke about my education as if it were a family achievement rather than a personal one. I did not argue with that idea. In many ways, it was true. They had always been involved in every decision. School choices, study programs, even which internships I considered applying for. They believed strongly in guidance, direction, protection. They said the world outside the family was complicated and sometimes dangerous. At the time, I thought that concern came from experience. After graduation, my days developed a routine that felt almost peaceful. I woke up early, usually before the rest of the house became noisy. I sat at the small desk in my room with a notebook and my laptop. I reviewed job listings, read descriptions carefully, and tried to match my skills with what companies were asking for. I kept detailed lists. Application deadlines, interview preparation notes, companies that had responded and companies that had not. My parents knew about this routine. They asked about it almost every evening during dinner. "Did you apply anywhere today?" my father would ask. I would tell him the names of the companies. Sometimes he asked more questions. "What kind of company is it? Where is the office located? Who interviewed you?" The questions felt normal at the time. Parents asking about their child's future. I answered them without hesitation. My mother often listened quietly during these conversations. Occasionally, she would offer practical advice about the types of employers I should trust and the ones I should avoid. She preferred smaller companies. "Big organizations don't care about people," she would say calmly. "They only care about numbers." My father had a different concern. He believed distance was dangerous. "If a job is too far away," he once told me, "it becomes difficult to stay connected with family." He never said I could not move, but the idea was always presented as a risk. At that point in my life, I still assumed their opinions were simply protective instincts. The job search itself was slow but encouraging at first. Some companies sent polite rejection emails. Others asked for additional information. A few invited me to interviews. Every invitation felt like quiet progress. I prepared carefully for each one. I studied the company websites. I reviewed the responsibilities listed in the job descriptions. I practiced answering interview questions out loud in my room, sometimes late at night when the house was silent. My parents liked hearing about interviews. My father especially seemed interested in the details. "What time is the interview?" he would ask. "Who will be there?" Did they give you a phone number or contact person? I assumed he asked these questions because he wanted to be helpful. Sometimes he even suggested things I should say. You should tell them you are reliable, he would say. Companies value reliability more than talent. My mother focused on something different. She always wanted to know the names of the companies, not just the general industry, the exact names. Occasionally, she asked for their phone numbers. At least one number, she would say, in case something goes wrong and we need to contact them. I remember pausing the first time she asked that question. It seemed unnecessary, but she explained it calmly. If you get sick or something unexpected happens, she said, we should know how to reach your employer. The explanation sounded reasonable, so I shared the information. I did not think about it again. At home, my parents behaved like people who believed in my future. They told relatives that I would find a good position soon. They encouraged me to stay patient and continue applying. Sometimes they reminded me that success rarely arrives quickly. Good things take time, my father often said. I accepted that idea easily. Patience had always been part of my personality. Looking back now, the strange part is how normal everything felt. Nothing dramatic happened during those early months. No arguments, no confrontations, just quiet routines. Applications sent in the morning. Research in the afternoon. Dinner conversations about companies and interviews. Trust was never something I consciously evaluated. It simply existed, like the walls of the house, solid, unquestioned. At least that is how it felt before the interviews started disappearing. Before employers began asking questions that had nothing to do with my qualifications. Before someone started calling them and telling them something about me that was not true. The first few rejections did not bother me. Job searches are slow by nature. Everyone knows that. Friends from university were experiencing the same thing. Applications go out. Responses take weeks. Interviews happen. Then sometimes nothing follows. It is part of the process. At least that is what I told myself. One of my first interviews had gone well enough that I allowed myself a small amount of optimism. The company was mid-sized, the office quiet and organized, and the manager who interviewed me seemed patient. He asked thoughtful questions, not trick questions, not aggressive ones. The kind that allow you to explain how you think. When the interview ended, he walked me to the elevator and told me they would likely schedule a second conversation soon. His tone was calm but encouraging. That evening, my parents asked about the interview during dinner. I told them everything I remembered. The company name, the building location, the manager's name, even the small details like how many people were working in the office and what the waiting area looked like. My father nodded thoughtfully as I spoke. "Sounds promising," he said. My mother asked one of her usual questions. "Did they give you a phone number in case you need to reach them?" I checked my notes and read the number printed at the bottom of the interview email. She listened carefully while I read it. The next morning, I woke up expecting a follow-up message. Instead, 3 days passed, then 5. By the end of the week, I sent a short, polite email asking if they needed any additional information from me. The response arrived the next day. It was brief. They had decided to move forward with other candidates. The message was professional and respectful, but it surprised me. The interview had not felt uncertain. It had felt stable. But uncertainty is normal in hiring decisions, so I let it go. A few weeks later, something similar happened again. Another interview. Another conversation that felt steady and constructive. Another manager who spoke about future steps. And then silence. Eventually, a rejection email appeared. This time the wording was slightly different. It mentioned internal considerations that prevented them from continuing with the process. I read the sentence several times. It felt vague in a way that was difficult to explain. But again, job searches often involve vague explanations. So I continued applying. Weeks turned into months. Patterns began appearing slowly. Recruiters who sounded enthusiastic during phone screenings sometimes stopped responding completely. Companies that scheduled second interviews occasionally canceled them with little explanation. Once, an interview was postponed twice before being canceled entirely. Every time something like this happened, I returned to my notes and tried to analyze what I might have done wrong. Maybe I spoke too slowly. Maybe I seemed uncertain. Maybe I lacked confidence. At dinner, my parents listened as I described these situations. My father usually gave the same advice. "You need to project more certainty," he said. "Employers can sense hesitation." My mother approached the situation differently. She emphasized patience. "The job market is unstable," she reminded me more than once. "Companies change their plans all the time." Sometimes her tone carried a strange calmness, not concern, just calm. One evening, after I explained that another company had stopped responding after a positive interview, she said something that stayed in my mind longer than I expected. "Maybe it's better," she said quietly. "Better?" I asked. "Some workplaces are not healthy environments," she replied. "You don't know what problems you might avoid by not joining them." The comment sounded protective, but there was something unusual about the way she said it. Not relieved, but almost certain. As if she had expected the outcome, I ignored the feeling. Instead, I focused on improving my approach. I practiced interview answers again. I rewrote parts of my resume. I studied articles about communication strategies. The more effort I invested, the more confusing the results became. Interviews still seemed to go well. Managers still expressed interest. But decisions kept changing after the conversations ended. Once, during a brief phone call with a recruiter, I heard hesitation in her voice before she ended the conversation. She had been friendly at the start, professional, then something shifted. Her tone became careful, measured, as if she were choosing words that avoided saying something directly. "We're reviewing some additional information," she told me. "What kind of information?" I asked politely. There was a pause. "Just part of our normal process," she replied. The call ended soon after that. That night I mentioned the conversation at dinner. My father shrugged. "Companies investigate applicants," he said. "Background checks are normal." I nodded. Of course they were normal. But something about the recruiter's voice had not sounded routine. It had sounded cautious, as if she had learned something unexpected. Still, I dismissed the thought. At that point, the idea that someone might be interfering with my job search seemed irrational. Why would anyone do that? And more importantly, how would they even know where I was applying? The question passed through my mind briefly. Then I moved on to the next application. The interview that changed the tone of everything happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The office building was older than most of the companies I had visited. The hallway carpets were worn and the lights hummed softly above the reception desk. It was the kind of place where people had been working for many years. Stable, quiet, predictable. I liked that. The hiring manager introduced himself with a firm but calm handshake. He spoke slowly, as if he had conducted hundreds of interviews and no longer needed to rush through them. We sat across from each other in a small conference room. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. He asked about my education, my coursework, and the projects I had completed during university. I explained my work carefully, taking time to answer each question without exaggeration. He listened. That alone made the conversation feel different from some of my earlier interviews. At one point, he leaned back in his chair and reviewed a page of notes in front of him. "You seem very organized," he said. "I try to be," I replied. He nodded. The tone of the interview suggested quiet approval. Not excitement, not enthusiasm, just steady professional interest. When we reached the end of the conversation, he closed the folder containing my resume and placed it on the table. Then he hesitated. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but I noticed it immediately. People pause when they are deciding whether to say something. His expression shifted slightly, not suspicious, not hostile, careful. "There's something I want to ask," he said. His voice remained calm, but the question that followed did not belong to the conversation we had been having. "Is there anything in your past that might appear during a background check that we should know about?" The question surprised me. "Like what?" I asked. "Legal issues," he said. "Criminal history, anything that could become a concern for the company." I felt a brief moment of confusion. "No," I said. "I've never had any legal problems." He watched my expression closely as I spoke, as if evaluating whether my answer was rehearsed. It was not. It was simply the truth. He nodded slowly but did not move on to another topic immediately. Instead, he picked up the folder again and opened it. "There was a phone call," he said. The words were quiet, almost reluctant. "A phone call?" I asked. "Yes." "When?" I asked. "This morning." The room felt slightly smaller after he said that. He did not sound accusatory. If anything, he sounded uncomfortable bringing it up. "Someone contacted the company," he continued. "They said they wanted to warn us about you." The sentence sat between us for a moment. I kept my posture still. "What did they say?" I asked. His eyes moved briefly to the notes on the page before him. "They said you had been involved in legal trouble." The words were precise, not emotional, just a statement. I felt the same confusion again, but this time it stayed longer. "That's not true," I said calmly. "I understand," he replied, "and I'm not assuming it is." His tone remained professional, but there was caution in the way he spoke. "Calls like that are unusual," he said, "but we have to consider them." "Did the caller give their name?" I asked. He shook his head. "No." They didn't identify themselves clearly. "What did they say exactly?" "They suggested we should reconsider hiring you." "Why?" "They claimed it could create problems for the company." He watched me quietly after saying that. I could feel that he was trying to determine whether my reaction seemed genuine. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. Instead, I spoke slowly. "I've never had any legal issues," I said again. "If necessary, I can provide a full background check." He nodded. "That might help clarify things." The interview ended shortly after that. He walked me to the door with the same calm politeness he had shown earlier. But the atmosphere had changed. Something invisible had entered the conversation and remained there. When I stepped outside the building, the afternoon air felt colder than before. As I walked toward the bus stop, my mind began reviewing the situation again and again. Someone had called the company, someone who knew my name, someone who knew I was interviewing there, and someone who was willing to lie about something serious enough to make an employer hesitate. At first, I tried to think of distant possibilities. Former classmates, old acquaintances, maybe someone who misunderstood something about my past, but none of those explanations made sense. Very few people even knew where I was applying. Most of my applications were private, except for the ones I mentioned during dinner. When I arrived home that evening, my parents were already sitting at the table. My father looked up. "How did the interview go?" he asked. I placed my bag beside the chair and sat down. "It was unusual," I said. My mother looked at me carefully. "Unusual how?" I explained what the hiring manager had told me, about the phone call, about the warning, about the accusation that I had a criminal record. For a brief moment, both of my parents looked surprised. Then my father shook his head slowly. "Some people are jealous," he said. My mother nodded in agreement. "Yes," she said softly. "Jealous people can be very destructive." Their reaction sounded supportive, but something about the speed of their explanation felt rehearsed. And for the first time, a small thought appeared in my mind. Not a conclusion, just a question. If someone had called that company, how did they know I had interviewed there that morning? After that interview, I started paying closer attention to conversations at home. Not in an obvious way. I did not confront anyone. I did not accuse anyone. I simply listened more carefully than before. The phone call from the hiring manager had changed something inside my mind. It had created a small space where doubt could exist. Before that day, I trusted my parents in a way that required no examination. Their advice, their questions, their opinions, those things had always been part of the structure of my life. But once doubt appears, even quietly, it changes how you hear people speak. 2 days after the interview, we were sitting at dinner again. My father asked the same question he asked almost every evening. "Did you apply anywhere new today?" "Yes," I said. I mentioned 2 companies I had submitted applications to that morning. He nodded and asked for their names. I told him. My mother listened silently for a few seconds before asking another question. "Are they large companies?" "One is medium-sized," I said. "The other one is smaller." She seemed satisfied with that answer. Then my father asked another familiar question. "Did either of them schedule an interview yet?" "Not yet," I said. "They only received the applications this morning." He nodded again and continued eating as if the conversation had ended. But this time I noticed something small. When I mentioned the companies, my mother had reached for a pen on the table and written something on a small piece of paper beside her plate. It happened quickly, quietly. The kind of movement most people would not notice unless they were watching carefully. I did not say anything. The next week, another interview invitation arrived. This time it was from the smaller company I had mentioned during dinner. The interview was scheduled for Thursday morning. When I told my parents about it that evening, they reacted the way they usually did. Encouragement, advice. My father reminded me to speak confidently. My mother suggested I prepare a few thoughtful questions to ask the interviewer. Everything appeared normal. The interview itself went well. The manager I met seemed professional and straightforward. We discussed the role, the responsibilities, and the company's expectations. Near the end of the meeting, he said something that had started to become familiar. "We'll review everything internally and contact you soon." I had heard that sentence many times before. Still, there was something about the way he said it that sounded sincere. For the first time in several weeks, I allowed myself a small sense of optimism again. But 3 days later, an email arrived. The message was polite, short. They had decided not to continue with my application. No explanation. Just a formal closing sentence thanking me for my time. I stared at the message longer than necessary. Then I closed the laptop and walked into the living room where my parents were watching television. "They decided not to move forward," I said. My father barely looked away from the screen. "That happens," he replied. My mother glanced at me. "Did they say why?" "No," she shrugged slightly. "Companies rarely explain their decisions." I stood there for a moment, unsure whether to say anything else. Then I mentioned something that had been sitting quietly in my mind. "The hiring manager from last week said someone called them," I said. My father turned his head slightly. "You already told us that." "I know," I said, "but it might be happening more than once." The room became quiet for a second, then my father laughed softly. "You're imagining things," he said. "I'm not imagining anything," I replied calmly. "I'm just noticing a pattern." My mother sighed. "You need to be careful with that kind of thinking," she said. "Why?" "Because it makes you look paranoid." The word landed heavier than the others. Paranoid. I said nothing for a few seconds. "I'm not accusing anyone," I said eventually. I'm just trying to understand why interviews keep ending the same way. My father turned the television volume down and looked at me more directly. Maybe the reason is simple, he said. Maybe employers just don't see you as the right candidate. His tone was not angry, it was calm, but there was something final about it, as if the explanation should end the conversation. My mother nodded slowly. You're intelligent, she said, but intelligence isn't everything. The message underneath her words was clear. The problem might be me, my communication, my personality, my attitude. After that night, the conversations about job applications changed slightly. Whenever I mentioned concerns about the strange phone call, the discussion turned quickly toward my behavior. My father suggested I might be overthinking things. My mother reminded me that the job market was difficult and that rejection was normal. If I mentioned the possibility that someone was interfering, the reaction was always the same. Dismissal, gentle at first, then slightly irritated. Eventually, the message became very clear. The problem was not external. The problem was my perception, my interpretation, my imagination. And after hearing that explanation enough times, a quiet question began forming inside my mind. Not about employers, not about interviews, but about the people telling me I was wrong. Because every time I mentioned the possibility of interference, their response came too quickly, too confidently, almost as if they already knew the answer. The conversation that confirmed my suspicions happened several weeks later. By that point, I had already attended more interviews than I could easily count. Some were short phone conversations. Others were formal meetings in offices that all looked strangely similar after a while. Conference tables, polite smiles, questions about teamwork and reliability. Most ended the same way: interest during the conversation, silence afterward, then a brief rejection message. I had stopped expecting anything different. But one afternoon, after another interview at a medium-sized consulting firm, something unusual happened. Instead of receiving a rejection email, I received a phone call. The number was unfamiliar. When I answered, the voice on the other end introduced himself as the hiring manager I had met earlier that week. His tone sounded careful, not unfriendly, just cautious. "Do you have a few minutes to talk?" he asked. "Yes," I said. There was a short pause before he continued. "I want to explain something that happened during our hiring process." I remained quiet and listened. "We received a phone call shortly after your interview," he said. The words were calm but direct, a familiar sentence. But this time his tone suggested he intended to go further than the others had. "What kind of phone call?" I asked. "A warning. About me?" "Yes." The word came without hesitation. I felt the same quiet tension I had felt during the earlier interview, but this time I was not surprised. "What did the caller say?" I asked. "They claimed you had been involved in criminal activity." He spoke the words carefully, as if repeating them made him uncomfortable. "That's not true," I said calmly. "I assumed it might not be," he replied. That answer caught my attention. "Why did you assume that?" I asked. "Because the call didn't sound official." "What do you mean?" "It sounded personal." The word hung in the air for a moment. "Did they say who they were?" I asked. Another short pause. "They said they were a concerned family member." For a few seconds, I did not say anything. My mind had been slowly approaching that possibility for weeks, but hearing the words spoken out loud created a different kind of weight. "A family member," I repeated. "Yes." "Did they give a name?" "No." "What exactly did they say?" The manager sighed quietly before answering. "They said they felt obligated to warn us about hiring you." "Why?" "They claimed you had legal problems in the past and that employing you could create risk for the company." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the words settle. "They sounded older," he continued. "Older?" Yes, the voice sounded like someone in their 50s or 60s. My parents were both in their late 50s. The thought arrived in my mind without effort. Still, I kept my voice steady. Did they provide any proof? I asked. No. Did they mention specific incidents? No. Then why did the company take the call seriously? Because they knew personal details about you. That sentence landed heavier than the others. What kind of details? I asked. They knew where you studied. They mentioned your degree. They even referenced the interview schedule. I felt something shift quietly inside my mind. Not shock, not anger, recognition. Only a very small number of people knew exactly where I was interviewing. And every one of those people existed inside the same house where I slept every night. I appreciate you telling me this, I said finally. You deserve to know, he replied. Will the company continue with my application? There was another pause. I'm afraid the hiring committee decided to move forward with other candidates. I understand, I said. And for what it's worth, he added, I personally didn't find the call convincing. Then why tell me about it? Because it sounded like someone was trying to damage your reputation. His honesty surprised me. That's what it felt like to us, he continued. Intentional interference. The phrase stayed in my mind long after the call ended. Intentional interference. After I hung up the phone, I sat at my desk and opened my notebook. The same notebook where I had been tracking job applications for months. But this time, I started writing something different. Dates. Interview times. Conversations during dinner. Questions my parents had asked about each company. The more I looked back through my notes, the clearer something became. Every interview that ended suddenly had one thing in common. My parents had known about it beforehand. Every company that had shown serious interest had been mentioned during dinner conversations, and every suspicious phone call seemed to appear shortly after those conversations happened. I did not jump to conclusions immediately. Instead, I simply looked at the pattern, quietly, patiently, the same way I approached most problems. Patterns rarely lie. By the time I finished reviewing the last few months of notes, a possibility had formed in my mind that I could no longer ignore. Someone was calling the companies. Someone who knew exactly where I was applying. Someone who knew personal details about my life. Someone who described themselves as a concerned family member. And suddenly, the calm reactions my parents had shown after every rejection began to feel different. Not supportive, not sympathetic, just unsurprised. Once the pattern became visible, I stopped looking for explanations. Instead, I began looking for confirmation, not through confrontation. Confrontation requires certainty, and at that moment I still did not have proof. Suspicion alone is a fragile thing. If you present it too early, it collapses under denial. So I continued behaving exactly as I always had. Quiet, routine, predictable. At home, nothing changed on the surface. I still sat at the dinner table each evening. I still answered my father's questions about job applications. I still listened while my mother offered advice about which companies might treat employees fairly. But internally, I had changed my approach. For the first time since beginning the job search, I started submitting applications without mentioning them to anyone in the house. The decision felt strange at first. Secrecy had never been part of my relationship with my parents. I had always assumed transparency was a form of respect. But if someone inside the house was responsible for those phone calls, transparency was no longer neutral. It was information, and information could be used. The first hidden application felt almost experimental. I applied to a small technology firm in another city. The process took less than 20 minutes. When the confirmation email arrived, I closed my laptop and said nothing about it during dinner that evening. My father still asked the usual question. "Did you apply anywhere today?" "Yes," I said. That answer was technically true. I had applied somewhere, but I did not say where. He nodded and continued eating, apparently satisfied with the response. 3 days later, the company emailed me to schedule an interview. I waited until I was alone in my room before replying. The interview took place over video call the following week. The conversation went smoothly. The manager asked thoughtful questions about my education and the projects I had worked on during university. When the interview ended, he told me they would contact me within a few days. Then something unusual happened. Nothing went wrong. No mysterious phone call. No sudden silence. 2 days later, the company scheduled a second interview. The pattern I had been observing for months did not appear. That alone was enough to create a quiet sense of certainty. But I needed more than one example, so I continued the experiment. Some applications I discussed openly at dinner, the way I always had. Others I kept completely private. Within a few weeks, the difference between the two categories became impossible to ignore. The applications my parents knew about began failing in familiar ways. Interviews ended with polite enthusiasm, followed by unexplained rejection messages. One recruiter who had seemed especially interested stopped responding entirely after our second conversation. But the applications I kept private moved forward without interference. Interview invitations arrived. Follow-up emails appeared exactly when they were supposed to. One company even scheduled a final interview with a department director. I began documenting everything carefully. Dates, times, which companies my parents knew about, which companies they did not. The pattern was precise. Not random, not coincidental. If my parents knew about the interview, something disrupted the process shortly afterward. If they did not know, the process continued normally. The conclusion felt unavoidable. Still, I did not confront them. Instead, I continued observing. One evening, my mother asked a question that sounded casual but caught my attention immediately. "You haven't mentioned many interviews lately," she said while clearing dishes from the table. "I'm still applying," I replied. "Yes, but companies should be responding by now." "They are," I said. That answer was also true, just not in the way she expected. She studied my face for a moment. "Which companies?" she asked. I mentioned 2 organizations that had already rejected me weeks earlier. Names I knew would lead nowhere. She nodded slowly. Later that night, while I was in my room reviewing notes, I heard my parents speaking quietly in the hallway outside. Their voices were low, almost careful. I could not hear the full conversation, only fragments. "Still applying. Not working. Maybe he'll understand eventually." The rest of the words were too quiet to distinguish, but something about the tone stayed with me. It did not sound like concern. It sounded like planning. Over the next month, the tension inside the house became subtle but noticeable. My parents asked more questions about my applications. My father occasionally suggested that the job market might be worse than I realized. "You shouldn't rush into the wrong position," he said more than once. My mother began emphasizing the advantages of staying close to home. "Some people spend years chasing careers that don't make them happy," she said one evening. "You already have stability here." The word stability felt heavier than it should have, because by then I understood something they did not realize. My job search had not been failing. It had been interrupted, quietly, repeatedly. And now that I had changed how information moved inside the house, those interruptions were no longer happening, which meant one more thing had also become clear. The phone calls had not stopped because the caller had lost interest. They had stopped because the caller no longer knew where to call. By the time the pattern became undeniable, something inside me had already changed. Not suddenly, not violently, just slowly, the way structures collapse when pressure builds over a long period of time. I had spent months believing the problem was somewhere outside the house. Competition, interview mistakes, misunderstandings. But once the evidence started arranging itself into a pattern, the direction of the pressure became clear. It was not coming from outside. It was coming from the same place where I slept, ate dinner, and spoke about my future every evening. The realization did not create anger at first. What it created was silence. I continued living in the house exactly the same way I always had. I woke up early. I prepared applications. I attended interviews. At dinner, I answered my father's questions with the same calm tone I had always used. But the answers had changed. Now they were carefully limited. I spoke about companies that had already rejected me. I mentioned applications that no longer mattered. Every important step in my job search happened quietly, without discussion. The strange part was how natural that silence became. For years, I had believed that sharing information with my parents was part of respect. Now I understood that information could also be used as a tool of control. Once I stopped providing that tool, something shifted in the atmosphere of the house. My parents began asking more questions, not directly suspicious ones, just more frequent, more specific. My father sometimes asked about the same company twice in the same evening. My mother occasionally asked whether certain interviews had been scheduled yet. Each time I answered calmly, but I never provided anything new. Meanwhile, outside the house, my life had started moving again. The technology firm I had applied to in secret invited me to a final interview with their department director. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. He asked practical questions about my work habits and how I approached complex problems. At the end of the meeting, he said something simple. "We'll be in touch soon." For the first time in months, the sentence did not sound like a polite ending. It sounded genuine. 2 days later, they called again, this time with an offer. I sat quietly at my desk while the hiring manager explained the position, the salary, and the starting date. My voice remained calm while I asked the necessary questions. But internally, something heavier was happening. Not excitement, not relief, something closer to recognition. Because the offer did not feel like a victory, it felt like confirmation. Confirmation that the barrier in my life had never been my abilities, it had been interference. When the call ended, I did not tell my parents. Instead, I opened my notebook again. For months, it had been filled with job applications, interview notes, and rejection emails. Now I added something different, a plan. The position was located in another city. Not extremely far, but far enough that commuting daily would be impractical, which meant relocation. The company offered assistance with moving expenses, temporary housing for the first few weeks, everything necessary to begin a new routine somewhere else. I accepted the offer the following morning. The paperwork arrived through email, contracts, employment verification forms, starting schedules. Each document represented something simple but powerful: independence. I signed everything quietly and sent the files back. Then I began making arrangements, not quickly, not dramatically, carefully. I contacted the housing coordinator the company had recommended. I confirmed the starting date. I researched transportation routes between the new apartment and the office. All of these steps happened while life inside the house continued exactly as it always had. Dinner conversations, television in the evenings, occasional questions about job applications. One night, my father asked something that made the room feel slightly colder. "Have you thought about what you'll do if the job search keeps failing?" he asked. I looked at him calmly. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes it's better to accept reality," he said. "What reality?" "That some paths simply don't work out." My mother nodded quietly beside him. You still have a home here, she said. You don't need to chase opportunities that might not exist. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. Then I said something simple. I understand. And I did, because by that point the truth was no longer hidden. They had tried to shape my future without telling me. They had tried to make failure appear natural, gradual, inevitable. But the evidence sitting quietly in my notebook told a different story. My job search had not failed. It had been interrupted. And now that interruption was ending. Not through confrontation, not through argument, just through distance. Sometimes the most powerful decision is the quiet one. The one that removes you from the place where control was being exercised. And that was the decision I had already made. They just didn't know it yet. I did not announce my decision immediately. For several days after signing the employment contract, life inside the house continued in the same quiet rhythm it always had. Morning routines, evening meals, the same questions repeated with small variations. My father still asked about job applications. My mother still spoke about patience. Neither of them realized that the process they believed was still failing had already ended. The job existed. The starting date had been confirmed. The apartment lease had been signed electronically. The only thing left was departure. I waited until the final week before the start date to say anything. Not because I wanted drama, but because the situation had already been shaped by silence. Ending it the same way felt appropriate. One evening after dinner, I told them. I accepted a job offer, I said. Both of them looked at me at the same time. My father spoke first. Where? In another city. The room became still. My mother placed her hands together on the table. What company? She asked. I told her the name. It was not a company I had ever mentioned before. That detail mattered. My father's expression changed slightly. Why didn't you tell us you were applying there? I applied quietly, I said. The answer was calm and simple, but the meaning behind it was clear. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then my father leaned back in his chair. When do you start? Next week. My mother frowned. That's very sudden. I've been preparing for a while. Another silence filled the room. Then my father asked something in a careful tone. Did something happen with the other companies? No. Then why keep this one secret? I looked at him for a moment before answering. Because something unusual kept happening with the others. Neither of them interrupted. Several employers received phone calls, I continued. Calls warning them about me. My mother's eyes moved slightly. Warnings, she asked. Yes. What kind of warnings? They were told I had a criminal record. The words hung in the air between us. My father shook his head slowly. That's ridiculous. Yes, I said. It is. I reached into my bag and placed a thin folder on the table. Inside were printed notes from the conversations I had documented during the past months. Dates, interview schedules, employer statements, descriptions of the calls they had received. I did not push the folder toward them dramatically. I simply left it there. The company said the caller described themselves as a concerned family member, I said. Neither of them opened the folder. Neither of them looked directly at it. Instead, my mother spoke first. You're suggesting something very serious. I'm not suggesting anything, I replied. I'm explaining what employers told me. My father's voice was calm, but there was tension in it now. People can say many things on the phone, he said. That doesn't make them true. I agree, I said. That's why I stopped telling people where I was applying. For the first time since the conversation began, my mother looked directly at me, and the calls stopped. The room became quiet again. A different kind of quiet this time, not confusion. Recognition. I did not accuse them directly. There was no need. The pattern existed in writing. The employers had described the voice as older, a family member, someone who knew personal details about my life. All of those facts existed without interpretation. Eventually, my father closed his eyes for a moment and sighed. "You're leaving next week?" he asked. "Yes." My mother finally opened the folder and looked at the pages inside. Her eyes moved slowly across the notes. Dates, names, times. Records of conversations with employers. After a few minutes, she closed the folder again. The denial that had once appeared so easily during earlier conversations did not return. Instead, she asked a different question. "Why didn't you confront us earlier?" I considered the answer carefully. "Because I didn't need to," I said. The evidence had already done the work. Arguments were unnecessary. That night, the house felt different, quieter, not because anyone was speaking loudly before, but because something unspoken had finally become visible. The control that had once existed quietly in the background had lost its structure, not through accusation, not through conflict, just through the simple act of removing information and leaving. I left the house 3 days later. There was no argument that morning, no dramatic conversation. My suitcase stood near the door while the car waited outside. The driver checked the address on his phone while I carried the last box down the steps. Inside the house, everything looked the same as it always had. The same furniture, the same quiet rooms. For most of my life, those rooms had felt stable, protective, certain. Now they simply felt finished. My parents did not try to stop me. They did not apologize either. My father stood near the kitchen doorway while I moved the final bag toward the door. "Call when you arrive," he said. "I will," I replied. My mother remained seated at the table. The folder I had placed there 2 nights earlier was still beside her. She had read every page, but there were no explanations left to offer. I closed the door behind me and walked to the car. The drive to the new city took several hours, long enough for the landscape outside the window to change slowly from familiar streets to unfamiliar highways. During the drive, I thought about the months that had disappeared, the interviews that had ended without explanation, the opportunities that had quietly vanished after phone calls I never heard. None of those things could be restored. Records can confirm the truth, but they cannot return lost time. By the time the car reached the apartment building the company had arranged, evening had already arrived. The driver unloaded my suitcase and left. I carried it upstairs alone. The apartment was small and mostly empty. Temporary furniture. A quiet kitchen. One window looking down at a street I had never walked before. For a few minutes I stood there without moving, not celebrating, not grieving, just recognizing something simple. The interference had ended, not because anyone admitted it, not because anyone apologized, but because the system that allowed it to happen no longer had access to my life. Sometimes the only real consequence for betrayal is distance, and sometimes distance is enough.